Montana Territory, August 1872. The heat inside the Silver Tail Saloon pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck, thick with sweat, cigar smoke, and something worse, desperation. 5 women stood on a makeshift platform at the front of the room, their wrists bound loosely with twine, their faces pale and still. A grizzled man in a stained vest waved a bottle in one hand, the other gesturing toward the women like they were sacks of wheat. "Mail-order brides straight from Chicago, St. Louis, and some place back east I cannot pronounce," he yelled. "Barely opened the crates, gentlemen." Laughter rolled through the crowd. Drunken men raised their glasses, some already throwing bids. In the corner, leaning against the wall near the swinging doors, a tall cowboy stood watching. His hat was pulled low, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone just passing through. He shifted his weight, jaw tight. His name was Nolan Everett, and he was not there by chance. The first woman, dark-haired, with a fading bruise on her cheek, was yanked forward. She flinched when a man grabbed her chin, inspecting her like livestock. That was it. Nolan stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under his boots. The auctioneer paused, blinking at the sudden movement. "You here to bid, stranger?" he asked. "No," Nolan said. His voice was calm, but it carried, the room stilled. "I am here to stop this." The auctioneer's eyes narrowed. "You got a badge hidden under that coat." "No," Nolan said, "but I got a spine. And I am not walking out while you sell human beings." The room crackled with tension. A few men stood, hands on their belts, eyes wary. Nolan moved fast. He reached the platform, untied the first woman's wrists. She stared at him, stunned. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded slowly, her voice a whisper. "Yes." "Name?" "Brielle Foster." He turned to the others. "I am getting you all out of here. You got a death wish," the auctioneer shouted. "These women were paid for, not anymore." Nolan stepped between them and the crowd. "You want to stop me, you better be ready to bleed for it." No one moved. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and calm in a way that made men think twice. "Let's go," Nolan said. Brielle stepped off the platform. The others followed, 2 blondes, a redhead, and a girl with tightly braided dark curls. They were all over 18, all terrified, and all walking toward freedom because one cowboy walked through the door. Outside, the sun was blinding. The street was quiet. Nolan led them toward the livery where his horse and wagon waited. "You got a plan?" Brielle asked, her voice steadier now. "I do," he said. "There is a ranch north of here. I was headed there. Belongs to a widow friend of mine. She will take you in until you get your footing." "You came to that saloon on purpose," she said. I heard whispers, figured it was true. Brielle looked at him, really looked. He had a scar near his temple and sunburned skin that said he worked hard and often. His hand brushed hers as he helped her into the wagon, and she felt the weight of it tough but gentle. The other women climbed in. Nolan took the reins. "My name's Nolan Everett," he said. "You are safe now." "I promise." They rode north, dust rising behind them like smoke from a long dead fire. Brielle sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes kept drifting sideways, watching him, studying. "You always rescue strangers?" she asked after a while. "No," Nolan said. "Only when my conscience won't let me do otherwise." She smiled, just a little. "You might be the only decent man I have met in years." He glanced her way. "That right, back home," I answered an ad. "Thought I was going to marry a schoolteacher in Wyoming." Got off the train and was shoved in a wagon. Next thing I knew, they were locking us in a cellar in that saloon. Her voice cracked. "That was 2 weeks ago." Nolan's hands gripped the reins tighter. "No one will hurt you again, not while I am around." She looked away, blinking fast. By sundown, they reached the ranch. A woman in her 50s greeted them, eyes wide as she counted the women climbing down from the wagon. Her name was Clara, and she hugged each girl like she had known them all her life. That night, Clara gave them beds, food, and privacy. Nolan sat on the porch, hat in his lap. He did not go inside. Brielle came out, her hair loose now, falling down her back. She sat beside him. "You are quiet," she said. He nodded. "Long day." "I never got to say thank you." "You do not have to. I want to." He turned toward her. The starlight caught her face, soft and open now, not afraid. "I was ready to give up," she said. "I thought that was it, that I was going to get bought by some man who would break me." Nolan was quiet for a beat. Then he said, I lost someone. Years ago, my wife, she was taken. Sold. Brielle's breath caught. I am sorry. I could not save her, but I could save you. She reached over, her fingers brushing his. Simple, steady. I am glad you did, she said. They sat like that for a long time, no words. Just the sound of crickets and the knowledge that something had shifted in the air between them. The next morning, Nolan saddled his horse. He meant to head out, let Clara take care of the rest, but Brielle came to the barn, hands clasped. You leaving? I figured I should. Why? He looked at her, really looked. Because I did what I came to do, she stepped closer. You sure that is all you came to do? Nolan swallowed. I do not want to take anything from you. Not after what you just escaped. You are not taking, she said. You are giving, you gave me safety, and maybe we could give each other something real. He stared at her, then nodded once. All right, he said. She smiled, eyes shining. Then stay. So he did. Brielle stood at the edge of Clara's garden, fingers trailing over the tall stalks of dill and marigold, eyes following the slow arc of Nolan's axe as it split a log clean in two. He hadn't spoken much that morning, but he hadn't left either. That had been enough. Clara had taken the other 4 women inside to sort through donated clothing and write letters to whatever family might still be looking for them. Brielle had offered to help, but her feet had carried her outside instead. You always work this early? She asked, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Nolan wiped his brow with the back of his hand, setting the axe down beside the growing woodpile. Sun comes up, so do I. Habit, she folded her arms, stepping toward him. You ever consider slowing down? I have. Doesn't last. Brielle tilted her head. Why not? Feels like waiting for something that ain't common. She nodded slowly, then picked up a piece of kindling and turned it over in her hands. I used to think if I stayed busy enough, I wouldn't have to feel anything. Turns out it just makes the loneliness quiet instead of gone. Nolan leaned against the chopping block, arms crossed loosely. You got away with words. I had a lot of long nights to think. He glanced toward the house. Clara said you used to teach, briefly. Before everything changed. She also said you asked about the livestock. I know how to milk a cow. My father raised jerseys, thought I should pull my weight. There was a pause, not empty, just waiting for one of them to tip the moment forward. You want to ride out with me later? Nolan asked. Fix in Clara's south fence. Could use another pair of eyes. Brielle gave a small, deliberate nod. All right. By late morning, they rode out along the bend where the hills folded low and the cottonwoods leaned into the wind. Nolan pointed out a place where elk used to cross before the rains shifted the creek. Brielle asked about the stars carved into the bark of one tree, and he told her they marked the grave of Clara's son. She said he died in the war, Brielle said softly. He was 17. Caught a bullet before he could fire one. They rode on without speaking for a while. The fence came into view a half-mile farther, leaning hard where the posts had sunk into soft ground. Nolan dismounted and began checking the line. Brielle tied off her mare and followed, squinting at the sagging wire. You want me to hold that while you reset the post? She asked. He handed her one end and drove his boot into the shovel. You always this sure-footed? I had to be. I wasn't raised for gentleness. He paused, hands on the post. What were you raised for? Endurance. Nolan nodded once like he understood more than he said. They worked in rhythm, dig, lift, tamp, tie. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last traces of morning chill, but neither complained. When they finished, they sat in the grass, passing a canteen between them. Brielle's cheeks were flushed from the heat, and Nolan's shirt clung damp against his back. Still, he looked at peace in a way she hadn't seen before. What do you want now? She asked, not looking at him. He took a long breath, a place to belong, one that doesn't vanish when I blink. Brielle turned to him. And do you think you found that? He met her eyes. I might have. She didn't smile, but something in her face softened. I told the others I wasn't going to trust anyone again. Not for a long time. Then don't, he said. Just start with me. He stood first, holding out a hand. She took it, the warmth of his palm grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. They rode back slowly, the wind tugging at their sleeves, the silence between them no longer sharp but steady. That evening, Clara brought out soup and cornbread, and the women gathered on the porch steps. Laughter drifted up from the kitchen. One of the younger girls had braided flowers into her hair. The light was golden, the kind that made everything look like it belonged. Brielle leaned against the porch rail. Nolan stood beside her, arms resting loosely on the top beam. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He turned toward her, eyes steady. "If you want to stay here, I'll build you a place, one with walls you choose, no locks." Her voice was quiet. "And if I want to stay close to you, then I'll be here." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of cut wood and warm bread. Brielle reached over, her fingers brushing his once more. This time she didn't pull away, neither did he. Behind them the world went on. But for the first time in a long while, neither of them flinched when it did. Rain had fallen just before dawn, leaving the earth dark and damp beneath the horses' hooves. Brielle walked the fence line near the east pasture, her skirts damp at the hem, a coil of twine looped over one shoulder. Nolan rode behind her, reins relaxed in one hand, watching her movements with quiet attention. "You ever think about going back?" he asked. She didn't turn. "To what?" "Wherever home was before." Brielle stopped beside a leaning post, bracing it with one gloved hand. "I don't believe it's there anymore." He dismounted and joined her, pressing his weight into the opposite side of the post. Together they got it upright, not even out of reach. "Just gone," she added, tying off the wire. Nolan nodded once. "Same." They kept moving, checking each span of fence in silence until they reached the stand of cottonwoods beyond the rise. The air smelled of wet bark and horses, and the faint sharpness of ironweed blooming near the creek. Brielle rested her hands on the top rail and looked out toward the edge of the property. "Clara said you used to run cattle. Still do, in a way. Lease out my northern acres to a pair of brothers. Don't need much now." "Why not sell?" He rubbed at the back of his neck. "That land's got bones in it. I know where everyone lies. I'd never be able to sleep if I let it go." She glanced at him, then away. "You ever want children?" His answer took a moment. "I did, still might if the right life shows up." Brielle's fingers tightened around the rail. "My sister had 3. She used to say her hands never stayed clean, but her heart did." "Where is she now?" "Died in the fever. Same year I left Illinois." Nolan didn't offer comfort. He just stood beside her, steady, present. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low, "about teaching again." "For real this time?" He tilted his head. "You'd stay out here. If there's a town willing to build a schoolhouse, I will. I want to do something that isn't just surviving." He studied her face, the way her eyes didn't soften when she spoke, the way her mouth pressed firm at the corners. "I know a place, 20 miles west, little settlement called Ransom Creek. They've been trying to raise funds for a school near the chapel. I can take you." She looked at him, uncertain. "You do that. I'd ride with you anywhere, Brielle." "You only have to ask." Her gaze held his for a long breath, something in it shifting. "I'm not ready to marry again, not yet." "I didn't ask you to," he said evenly. "But I don't want to be alone either." "Then don't be." A bluebird landed on the fence post a few feet down, wings fluttering before it stilled. Nolan watched it for a moment, then turned back to her. "Come with me to Ransom Creek next week, just to look, no promises." She nodded. "All right," he adjusted the brim of his hat. "I'll tell Clara we'll be gone a few days." As they turned back toward the house, the sun broke through the thinning clouds, casting long shadows behind them. The soil squelched beneath their boots, but neither minded. They didn't speak on the walk back. They just moved side by side, not touching, not needing to. From the kitchen window, Clara watched them approach. She didn't smile, but she poured 2 mugs of coffee and set them side by side on the table anyway. The wagon rattled over flat country west of Clara's ranch, wheels cutting soft grooves into the drying earth. Nolan held the reins with one hand, the other resting lightly on the bench between them, not quite touching Brielle's skirt. She sat upright, back straight, gaze fixed far ahead. Her hair was pinned close, her bonnet tied snug against the wind. Ransom Creek was still several miles off, but the land was already changing, fewer cottonwoods, more open grassland, the hills drawn lower against the sky. "I passed through here once," Nolan said after a stretch of silence. "Wasn't much then. Few tents, a church with no roof, and a woman selling stew out of a tin pot." "Why'd you come?" Brielle asked, not turning. Chased a stallion down from the divide, took me 3 days to catch him, sold him to a trader who couldn't ride worth a damn. She let out a quiet breath. And you stayed upright, barely. My shoulder wasn't right for weeks. He glanced at her. You ever been thrown, once, from a mule? I was 12 and too proud to admit I didn't know what I was doing. What happened? I broke my wrist and cried in the barn until my father found me. Didn't ride again for a year. He looked at her hands folded in her lap. You hide pain well. Not always, just learned where to put it. Ahead, the town came into view smaller than expected, a scatter of buildings around a dusty main road. The chapel stood on the far end, its steeple leaning slightly eastward, shingles stripped from the bell tower. A few children ran along the boardwalk, and somewhere a hammer struck wood with rhythmic insistence. They pulled up beside the general store. A man with a patchy beard and a limp stepped out, wiping flour from his hands. Nolan tipped his hat. Where can we find the chapel committee? He asked. The man pointed with his chin. Try the smithy. Preacher's brother works iron. They've been drawing up plans. Nolan helped Brielle down, his hand steady at her waist. She didn't pull away, but she didn't linger either. They walked side by side, boots raising soft puffs of dust with each step. The smithy was louder than the rest of the town, a steady clanging echoing off rough-hewn walls. Inside, a tall man with soot-streaked sleeves stood over an anvil, shaping what looked like a plow blade. He looked up without pausing. You hear about the school? Brielle stepped forward. Yes. I heard you were looking for a teacher. He set the hammer down. Can't pay much, but there's space behind the chapel for a cabin. You'd have your own stove, no boarders. I'm not concerned with money, she said. I just want to do the work. He studied her a moment. You got experience? Yes, he nodded. Talk to the preacher, he'll want to meet you. They found the preacher behind the chapel, pulling weeds along the back fence. He wore a hat too wide for his head and boots that looked borrowed, but his voice was firm when Brielle introduced herself. If you stay, we'll build the schoolhouse by autumn, he said. We'll need help with the children until then. I've been teaching them letters out of a hymnal. I can start tomorrow, she said. He looked to Nolan. You her husband? No, Nolan answered. Just brought her here. The preacher nodded slowly. We're glad to have both of you. They stayed in town through dusk, helping move lumber from the livery to the chapel. Brielle rolled up her sleeves, hands raw from lifting, but her face was brighter than Nolan had seen it. She spoke with a woman who'd recently lost her husband and another who'd come west with 5 children and no shoes among them. She listened more than she spoke. As the sun dropped below the horizon, Nolan waited with the wagon while she said goodbye. When she returned, her steps were slower, more thoughtful. They want me to come back next week, she said, climbing into the seat. Help with the planning, choose the paint. You want to? I think I do. They rode in silence for a while, the sky deepening to indigo. Crickets stirred in the grass and the air smelled of dry hay and distant smoke. You ever think about staying put? She asked softly. I have, more lately. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. With anyone, he turned toward her. With someone I knew wouldn't leave when things got hard. I wouldn't. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, I believe you. The road narrowed as the wagon turned east, the ruts familiar again. The ranch lights flickered in the distance. Nolan reached over, his hand closing around hers, and this time she didn't hesitate. They didn't speak again until they reached the gate, but something had settled between them. Not a promise, not yet, but the shape of one. By late September, the air had turned dry and brittle, the kind that cracked skin and kept water pails from holding their chill for long. Brielle stood barefoot in Clara's back room, folding the last of the spare linens Clara had lent her. Her things were packed, not many, just 2 dresses, a stitched journal, and the heavy wool shawl Nolan had bought her in town without much ceremony. He waited in the front yard, one hand resting on the mare's reins, his hat low as he watched the chickens scratch around the yard. Clara came to the door behind him, wiping her hands on her apron. She's ready, Clara said. Nolan turned. She's sure? She's more sure than most I've seen. Brielle stepped out with her bundle tucked against her chest. I left the extra soap by the basin, she said. And the tin of cloves in the pantry. I know you like them in your tea. Clara nodded, then pulled her into a firm, quiet hug. You got people now, Brielle, don't forget it. Brielle didn't answer. She only held on a few seconds longer before stepping back. The wagon was lighter than before, the seat worn smooth from shared miles. Nolan helped her up without speaking, then climbed in beside her. As they turned toward the road, Clara raised her hand once, then let it fall. They stopped in Ransom Creek long enough to drop off the last of the seed money Clara had tucked into Brielle's bag, enough to buy glass panes for the schoolhouse windows and a stove that wouldn't smoke out the children. Reverend Carson met them by the chapel and handed Nolan a folded note. From the blacksmith, he said. He says the nails'll be ready by Tuesday. We'll be back by then, Nolan replied. Brielle watched the exchange, her fingers curled around the edge of the wagon seat. Where are we going? Nolan didn't glance at her. To see a ridge I want you to know. They rode west, past the settlement's edge and through a stretch of meadowland where the prairie dogs chirped and scattered at the sound of hooves. The land began to rise gently at first, then steeper, until the wagon slowed to near crawling. At the top, Nolan halted the horse and gestured. Below lay a shallow valley with a winding creek and tall ash trees lining the banks. A small cabin stood near the northern edge, smoke curling from a half-choked chimney. I had it built last spring, Nolan said. Didn't know why exactly. Just kept doing it piece by piece. Brielle stared at it. You built a home with no one in it. Wasn't empty, he said. I just hadn't met the person it belonged to yet. Her throat tightened. She climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the porch, running her hand over the railing. The wood was smooth, the steps solid. A tin basin sat beside the door, filled with rainwater. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and old tobacco. There was one bed, one table, and two worn chairs, each made by hand, none of it fancy. A patchwork quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed. Brielle turned. Nolan stood in the doorway, his hat in his hand. I won't push you, he said. If you want to stay in town, keep your own place, I'll help you build it. But if you want this, he stopped. If you want me, I'm yours. She stepped toward him. You think I'd let you sleep in some drafty bunkhouse while I lived 2 miles away? He gave a soft laugh, the first in days. Didn't figure you would. I want the school and I want this place. Her hand reached for his. But mostly I want you. He didn't speak. He just pulled her close and kissed her, slow and sure, like a man who'd spent years learning the weight of silence and had finally found something to say. They spent the next day cutting firewood and hauling buckets from the creek. Brielle etched lesson plans by lamplight while Nolan patched the roof. They slept side by side on the narrow bed, her head tucked under his chin, his hand resting over hers. By the time the first frost came, the schoolhouse walls were up. Brielle taught the children from benches Nolan had built, using slates and chalk she'd bartered for with Clara's dried herbs. The children listened, wide-eyed, while Nolan repaired shoes outside or mended fence posts along the eastern lots. They ate supper together every evening, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with quiet. When Brielle had a hard day with a restless boy or a girl too frightened to speak, Nolan didn't offer solutions. He placed a cup of coffee in her hands and sat beside her until the weight lifted. One evening, while the snow began to gather gently on the porch rail, she stood beside him in the doorway, both of them wrapped in their coats. You ever think you'd end up like this? She asked. No, he said, but I hoped. She leaned into his side. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be safe. He kissed her temple. You won't have to anymore. They married by the creek in early spring, with Clara and Reverend Carson standing beside them and the schoolchildren tossing handfuls of wildflowers. No rings, just a vow and a promise, sealed with a kiss and followed by a meal of roasted venison and cornbread. Years later, the valley still held their cabin. Children's laughter echoed from the schoolhouse, and rows of beans climbed trellises behind the porch. Nolan built a second chair for the table, smaller, for a daughter with Brielle's quiet eyes and his steady hands. They grew older together. Stronger not in spite of what they'd lost, but because of it. And in the end, what they built was not a rescue or a refuge, but a life. Whole and full and shared, every day of it.